Welcome everybody and good afternoon. This is a UCL Minds lunch hour lecture on the UK's PISA data, should it be trusted? I'm Gemma Moss, I'm chairing this session. I'm the director of the International Literacy Centre at UCL Institute of Education, and I'm delighted to introduce our guest lecturer, John Jerrim. He is Professor of Educational and Social Statistics at UCL Institute of Education, and I have known him for a very long time. We have been having ongoing discussions about the impact of reading for pleasure on children's attainment and whether PISA can resolve that issue for us. John has worked on PISA data for over 10 years, both at the OECD as Thomas J. Alexander Fellow. He's the lead author of the PISA 2015 National Reports for England, Wales and Northern Ireland, and has published more than 20 academic articles using the data. So I'm looking forward to hearing what he has to say about its trustworthiness and potentially its uses in political debate, though that's me adding to his title. We are running a Q&A. The Q&A is going to run through Slido. You should have had the link to Slido in the information that came with this event. Just in case you can't find the link, if you go to sli.do and enter the code LHL2, you will find yourself in the Slido chat room. So without more to do, over to John, and I'm looking forward to hearing more.
Cool, thank you very much, Gemma. Yeah, I'm not sure I am going to talk a lot about political debate, but you can feel free to ask some questions around it. I'm sure we'll end up touching on it today, given that today's election day as well. So what better time to be talking about educational attainment across the UK and using kind of PISA data. So let's start off with what is PISA in a nutshell for people who don't know. Well, it's an international study of 15-year-olds' achievement in reading, science and mathematics. It's been conducted every 3 years since 2000, although the UK data from 2000 and 2003 are now excluded due to problems with it. Conducted in more than 70 countries. And one of the key things is it's very widely known and very influential, has major impact upon policymakers, politicians, reporters. The 2018 data was released in December 2019, and the next lot of PISA tests are going to be conducted in 2022, having been delayed for 1 year due to the pandemic. So I'm expecting probably most people in the audience and who watch this know a little bit about PISA already. To give you some context behind this talk, let's just say we're going to trust the data completely. This is how the results look across the UK between 2006 and 2018, focusing on mathematics. So what we should see here is that, well, Scotland has had a bit of a decline over time, particularly in 2018 compared to previous rounds. In comparison, England's scores went up in 2018 relative to 2015 and beforehand. You see Wales down the bottom here with a bit of a U shape where they took a plunge between 2006 and 2012, but have since returned upwards. And Northern Ireland, nothing really as interesting has happened. It's been kind of very much steady as she goes over that kind of 12-year period. The background to this, kind of the academic background to this is, well, PISA is very influential, but it's come under a lot of criticism from different quarters as well, for various different reasons. There's been issues raised with the sample design and the response rate, the cross-national comparability of the test. So is this reading question delivered in England the same as this reading question delivered in Japan? The methodology used to actually create the test scores is incredibly complicated using an item response theory model, which not many people kind of understand. The fact it's a low stakes test, right? So there's this view that, well, there's nothing riding on the results. So why should kids put in maximum effort? And that type of thing may vary across country. And also one of the most interesting things I think about PISA is that it's now delivered on computer, whereas previously it was all on a standard kind of paper and pencil test. that brings into question, well, how comparable are the scores over time? And there's various different works from the literature, both from myself, but from other people as well, discussing all of these various issues. And this work, which is based on a paper that I released a couple of weeks ago and is forthcoming in a journal called Review of Education, basically does a case study playing into this literature focused around two key issues. The first is around kind of how representative the data is and how that may affect international comparisons. But also, secondly, which I think is equally as important, is how transparently this key information has been reported in national reports and by the OECD and whoever. And I'll walk through this kind of throughout the presentation today. So how does PISA get interpreted in the public domain? Well, and how would you kind of test whether educational achievement in one country is different to educational achievement standards in another? So let's take two countries here, England and Japan. Well, one solution could be that you test all children in England and all children in Japan using the same test and compare the scores and the distribution of scores between the two. Of course, that doesn't happen because it would be ridiculously expensive to do. So what typically happens is that you draw some kind of random sample from England, some kind of random sample from Japan, and that also provides a fair basis for comparison if you can do that. Random sample country A, random sample country B, we can compare the two and look at differences in, say, average test scores. In theory, it's great. In practice, it's not so straightforward. And this includes for kind of comparisons within a country over time as well, where some aspects of what's being tested and how it's being conducted may change as well. And that will play into the story that I'm going to speak about as well. And this is kind of illustration of the issues that can happen reducing the representativity of the samples. So to me, we no longer have a random sample from the population. So we start with all 15-year-olds in the country. We take a random sample of those 15-year-olds, but then we might end up excluding some children from that sample, for instance, because of special educational needs, meaning that they can't access the tests. The problem comes in if different countries handle children with special educational needs in different ways. So some countries may end up assessing them, whereas other countries don't assess certain types of children. There's differences in eligibility criteria potentially as well, which I'll speak about in the context of Scotland. And of course, even when you've got your sample or you've drawn your sample, you approach schools to say, hey, will you take part in PISA? They may say no. And even if they say yes, within those schools, children may not turn up on the day of the test because they're ill, because they're playing truant, because this is a test of 15-year-olds, and that's what happens in schools. Or their parents may not consent to their child taking part in the study. And so you end up moving from a representative sample of all 15-year-olds to the sample that you actually have in the end. And what I'm going to discuss in this lecture is basically how we move from here to here and some of the problems that can creep in. With a case study for the PISA 2018 data for the UK. And how I'm going to start this is by focusing on Scotland, where there are kind of some particularly interesting and challenging issues. And again, I'm aware today's election day, so what better time to talk about some kind of devolved UK education issues. And I'm going to talk about three particular things that happened in PISA 2018 with the data for Scotland. Firstly, the date that the PISA test is conducted in Scotland, or was conducted in Scotland, changed. So between 2006 and 2015, PISA was conducted between March and May in Scotland. But in 2018, it moved to October, November time. The same's not true for England, Northern Ireland, as Wales, which always conducted the test October, November, December time from 2006 and 2018 to 2018. So this is something very specific that happened in Scotland. Secondly, Scotland, as you'll see, was a huge outlier internationally in one respects in the number of children that was considered ineligible for the test. And I'll discuss that in a second. And thirdly, many of the remaining pupils within the sample didn't actually sit the test for various reasons. And I'll go on to illustrate that. So let's start firstly with the change of the test dates. Well, why is that important in the context of PISA? Well, PISA is a test of 15-year-olds within a country, or children who are born 15 years and 3 months and 16 years and 2 months. So what happens when you change the test date? Well, you end up changing the composition of the sample, essentially, that you end up testing. And this is kind of what ended up playing out in Scotland. So this table here I show the percentage of the PISA sample that were in year group S3, year group S4 and year group S5 between 2006 and 2018. And what you should be able to see in Scotland is, well, between 2006 and 2015, the vast majority, about 90%, were in S4. But with the change of the test date in 2018, that changed to a 50-50 split between S4 and S5. Now, this is kind of an important change because S4, I believe, in Scotland, at the end of S4, is when children sit their national examinations. So the equivalent in England would be, well, previously in PISA, we've just always tested year 11 pupils pretty much. Next time, let's test a mixture of year 11s and year 12s. Well, that's a bit different, right? That's not exactly comparable over time. Now you're testing children in an older school year group. So it has problems in terms of many different ways, but including, well, who exactly are we testing now? And that's changed kind of quite a lot over time. The second issue to highlight about Scotland, I show in this graph here, and this is the number of ineligible pupils. Well, what do we mean, first of all, by ineligible pupils? Well, it seems that if children, this is the main reason for ineligibility, it seems in PISA, if children leave the school or move school between the time that the sample is drawn and at the time that the test is conducted, then they're considered ineligible because they've moved across to a different school, and actually testing them would be really difficult to do. Fair enough. The issue comes in here with this graph. And what I'm showing you here is this ineligibility rate in PISA 2015, and then up the vertical axis, the ineligibility rate in 2018, with each of these blue blobs here being a country, and these red lines showing the OECD average for these figures. Now, the really interesting thing for Scotland is it's an absolutely massive outlier, and it's a massive outlier in two ways, actually. Firstly, clearly, it's way above the level for almost all other. And secondly, it's an outlier in terms of the change between 2015 and 2018. As in 2015, there was only about 4% ineligible, and in 2019, it's got up to 9%. So this seems worth commenting upon. This seems important, right? Why has this actually happened? And through my kind of various bits of kind of digging or working it out, I think it's due to the change of the test date that I spoke about previously. So children at the end of S4, a lot of them will take national examinations. They have kind of those credentials in the bank, and then they'll move on to different destinations, potentially move school to like a vocational school, leave school, whatever. And so it ends up that therefore they've ended up with this high ineligibility rate. One of the key things about this is, well, who changes school? Who might leave school after they're taking their examinations, or who might move to a vocational school or didn't pass the education system? Well, we know from various bits of evidence, it's not random. It tends to be lower achievers, right? So what would happen, or what I believe has probably happened here, is this ineligibility has led to Scotland systematically excluding probably a lot of the lower achieving end of its distribution. And then let's move on from that and say, well, okay, amongst those that were eligible, what percentage of children actually kind of sat the test? This is what I show here for all OECD countries, where along the horizontal axis here, I've got the pupil response rate, what percentage of children who were eligible actually got tested. The green line here shows the average across OECD countries, where it's just over 90%. And I've also put a red line here for a value of 80%. And I've put that value there because the OECD rules states that if you get under 80%, then your sample's at risk of bias and you have to present a non-response bias analysis. The key point from this graph is, well, actually, Scotland's response rate was about 80%, the second lowest out of any of the participating countries. And again, these children who don't take the test are unlikely to be randomly selected from the sample, right? Who plays truant, who's more likely to be absent from school? It tends to be children who are lower achievers. So again, this non-response problem is likely to mean we've excluded lower achievers from the sample. One of the most interesting things actually about doing this paper was working out how exactly how the hell does the OECD actually calculate this response rate figure? So I've said, you know, if you fall below this 80% figure, you're meant to do a non-response bias analysis. Well, if you go to the Scottish National Report like I did, it will tell you the figures are, well, after you excluded the ineligible children, there's 3,767 eligible children, and there's 2,998 that took part. I'm not great at maths. If I do that calculation, I get 79.6%. I'm below the threshold. But if you go to the OECD reports and if you go to the Scottish National Government report, it reports a figure of 80.5%, just above the threshold, which has meant Scotland falls there, just over the line, rather than there, just below the line. And the OECD and the Scottish Government turn around and hold their hands up and say, hey, we've met the technical standards, no problem here. I said I wouldn't get political, but, you know. But how have they managed to do that with these numbers? Well, actually, what the OECD do is have some fairly interesting accounting mechanisms to kind of calculate this figure. And what they end up doing is saying, well, if your school has a really low pupil participation rate, so if less than 50% of your kids take part, we're going to exclude the entire school, but we're not going to count those figures in the pupil response rate calculation. We're going to include them in the school non-response rate calculation. So actually, what they end up doing is taking this figure here, which is the denominator in this calculation, and lopping 2 schools, which includes 80 sample children, off of it. So basically, that's how they got to 80.5% instead of 79.6%. The key takeaway message from that kind of slightly discussion is Scotland got away without doing a bias analysis according to the OECD rules due to an anomaly, a very strange anomaly with how these kind of response rates are kind of calculated, not due to kind of any kind of more technical or scientific reason. Okay, so far I've spoken about these problems in isolation, but if I go back to this slide here, what you'll see is, well, these things together have a cumulative impact, right? So let's put a figure on that cumulative impact. What impact does this ineligibility and non-response have together? And what we can do is take from some OECD figures an estimate of the total number of 15-year-olds in Scotland for this cohort, which was about 53,000, and then subtract various numbers from this to take into account the non-response, which were also reported in the OECD figures, to give you a final figure in the overall weighted sample. And that what we can see there is a figure of 63%. In other words, we've lost almost about 40% of kids from our random sample due to various different things, such as ineligibility, such as non-response. So we no longer potentially have a random sample. One of the key points around this is, well, this is something that does seem to be more of a problem in Scotland and the UK than elsewhere. So this figure of 63%, the difference between the final sample and the kind of intended sample, Scotland and the UK perform poorly. There's many countries where the figures are kind of 85, 90, 95%. So this does seem to be a bigger problem than this in this country than elsewhere. Now, the million-dollar question is, well, what impact might this have on the results? And frankly, no one knows for sure. I don't know for sure because I don't have the tools. You need some additional data. So what we ended up doing in our paper, and I've done this for some other countries well previously in another paper, is to say, well, let's run a simulation study. The only assumption we make in this simulation study is that those children that didn't take part perform on average lower than those children in, say, Scotland that did take part. The motivation for that assumption being, well, again, people who play truant, people who have special educational needs, the ineligibility with children moving school, they're all likely to be kind of lower achieving children, but we don't know how much lower. So what we do is basically simulate data saying, okay, what results do we get if we assume that those children score a little bit lower than the rest of the kids in Scotland on average that did take part in the study? What happens if they perform massively lower? And then kind of our central estimates here. I'm not going to go through the technical details of that, but what we believe is plausible is that the Scottish figures for PISA 2018 are somewhere between 10 and 15 points overestimated. So they're the technical details behind it. How were all these kind of important things handled by the Scottish government when they reported the results? Well, in a nutshell, they weren't. They just were not discussed at all. So if you go to the PISA 2018 report, it's really interesting because they have a section on changes over time, some various caveats about how you should interpret the results and the caution needed. They don't mention the change of test month. They don't mention that in 2018, half the sample are now in S5, whereas previously they weren't. It's just not in there at all. This kind of massive outlier that they are in this graph here due to the ineligibility, it's not mentioned at all. The implications of it aren't mentioned at all. And there's no attempt to assess the potential bias kind of from any of the things that I've kind of spoken about. And I think one of the difficult things is we do, or they do have the tools potentially to do it. There's national administrative data where you could see, well, this is how the full sample did in national exams. This is how the PISA sample did in national exams. Let's compare the two to see if there's any bias in the sample. But that hasn't been done. In general, my view is that the Scottish government and the way this has been reported really, really lacks kind of transparency. Let's move on next to different parts of the UK, and let's talk about England and Northern Ireland and some bias analyses they had to do there, but actually never got published. So PISA does have certain rules, including around school response rates. In other words, you need to get a certain percentage of schools selected in the sample to respond, otherwise you might be kicked out, essentially. Now, this graph going along the horizontal axis here shows the response rate of schools. In PISA, if you approach a school and they say, no, I'm not going to take part in the study, what the OECD allow you to do is to approach a substitute school in its place. So up the vertical axis is the response rate after those substitutes have been included. So horizontal axis before, vertical axis after. The key thing to know about is that if you fall within this light blue zone up here, you're judged to be okay in terms of your school response rate, you're allowed into PISA. If you're in this dark blue zone over on the left, then the opposite holds true. You're meant to be kicked out as a matter of course because you haven't hit the response rate. That doesn't actually happen. The Netherlands, I think in 2015, fell below it and was still allowed in, but you know, that's at least what the OECD claim. if you fall into this triangle here, which was what happened in England and Northern Ireland, the OECD rules say, well, we don't quite know. You have to do a bias analysis to show or to prove that your sample's unbiased. And so England and Northern Ireland had to do it. The trouble is, England and Northern Ireland conducted this bias analysis. It just never got published anywhere. The only thing that got published was basically one paragraph or two paragraphs in the OECD report and one paragraph in each of the England report and the Northern Ireland report, where basically they say things like, well, we investigated differences between responding and non-responding schools. This supported the case that no notable bias would result from non-response. That's what the OECD said. The PISA report said, this analysis demonstrated that no notable bias would result from non-response. In Northern Ireland is even vaguer. The results from both non-response bias analysis were positive. What does positive mean? I'm not quite sure. But it says that the samples were representative and not biased. But the actual evidence isn't or wasn't in the public domain. So this annoyed me. I want to see the evidence. Show me the evidence. Why is it not there? Why is it not published? You know? So I put in a freedom of information request and I got hold of it. So I could see actually what happened. And I think there's two key points from kind of my investigations. One I show in the table here. But the first one is the investigations that were conducted were really, really limited. Basically, it only looked at a few school level characteristics and there wasn't kind of much detail in there. I'd say secondly, on top of that, the sample sizes, because it was a school level analysis, were really small and they put a lot of weight on statistical significance when you've got a small sample size, nothing statistically significant, which in this example allowed them to say, well, you know, not statistically significant a lot of the time, therefore it's no bias. But thirdly, which I show in the table here, which I think is the most important, is that they compared the historic GCSE attainment of these responding and non-responding schools. It was a very coarse measure that they used. They just compared the percentage of schools in the top 60% of the historic GCSE distribution to the percentage of schools in the bottom 40% of the historic GCSE distribution. And let's take the figures in the first row here. What you should be able to see here is that, well, amongst responding schools, 66% of responding schools are in the top 60% of the historic GCSE distribution, but for non-responding schools, it was only 38%. In other words, schools with weaker historic performance in their GCSEs were less likely to say, yes, I'm going to take part in the study. How does that relate to what we see here in the comments in the technical report, where they say there's no notable bias? You know, this fact wasn't mentioned anywhere. It was just saying there'll be no noticeable bias. This just wasn't discussed anywhere. And similar investigations were conducted in Northern Ireland as well. Again, first key point, the characteristics examined were incredibly limited. The only things they looked at was school type, region, and school gender to judge the representativity. So that's not a lot of things to be looking at. Secondly, the sample sizes were tiny. You know, there's just 80 schools in the sample. So the idea of statistical significance, which they draw on a lot, doesn't really have that much use or meaning. And finally, actually grammar schools, which we know would typically include higher achievers, again, were more likely to respond and to take part in PISA than non-grammar schools were. So again, this just got boiled down to this statement: the non-response biases were positive and the data is representative and not biased, when the actual evidence that was produced is a lot more nuanced than that. I don't think it's as clear cut as being presented. So my overall take on this non-response bias analysis is that the statements made by the OECD and the Department for Education is only actually a partial reflection of the true situation. The bias analyses that were conducted are very limited in scope. And again, the disappointing thing in many ways is a lot more detailed bias analysis were perfectly possible. take England, for example. For the PISA sample, we would know at the time that these bias analyses were conducted, their key stage 2 test scores. We could have compared at the pupil level key stage 2 test scores of the PISA sample to the initially drawn sample or to the population to see how they differ, to work out, is there any bias in the sample? My overall view of the evidence that's been presented is that it's mixed and it doesn't provide much reassurance, and that basically the absence of evidence is being treated or interpreted as the absence of bias. The fact is that they simply haven't looked very hard to try and find bias, because why would they? Who wants to go out and find, oh yeah, we've got a bias sample? You're just not going to do it, because the people doing it aren't really independent from how the study is conducted. It's just a tricky situation. So what I also did, or decided to do, was say, well, in my freedom of information requests, because the PISA sample for England and for Wales also have been linked to the National Pupil Database and administrative data, let's look at the GCSE grades that's been achieved by the PISA sample and compare that to what we know about the distribution of GCSE grades amongst the entire population, to see if these statements are basically true. Is there any evidence of bias or not? And here's what you get for the results for England when you make that comparison. So these are GCSE mathematics grades for England on the new 9 to ungraded scale, where figures grades below 4 mean they haven't kind of met the standard pass threshold. And the figures here in the first column refer to those for PISA. Whoops. Figures here refer to PISA, and here's what we know from the national distribution of achievement. And what you should be able to see here is that in PISA, lower achievers in England have been systematically underrepresented in the table, in the data. So we should be able to see that in England, 21% of the PISA sample didn't achieve a grade 4 in mathematics, compared to 28% in the population as a whole. In other words, in contrast to what was said here, that there's no demonstrable bias, hey, here's some demonstrable bias that is in the sample. It may or may not be due to the problem of school non-response, but this is something, again, that can easily be done and easily shown, but wasn't. And we can do something very similar for Wales. Wales is an interesting example because, unlike England, they did meet the school non-response criteria, school response criteria. And there was no kind of issues flagged with their data by the OECD, but we can see a very kind of similar situation occur. So in Wales, 31% of the sample, the PISA sample, didn't achieve a C grade, whereas the figure in the population is much higher. It's around about 42%. In other words, the PISA sample has systematically excluded lower achieving pupils in Wales. How does this potentially affect comparisons between England, Wales, and other countries? Very hard to say for sure, because we can do this type of investigation for England and Wales. We can't do it for other countries. As I kind of suggested in this table back here, there's reasons to suspect that there's bigger problems in the UK countries than elsewhere, though it's hard to believe that similar problems don't happen in all other countries. With that caveat in mind, what I ended up trying to do was basically say, well, let's take the bias that we see in these last two tables and estimate what it would mean in terms of PISA points. And I do that essentially by multiplying these figures of the average PISA scores achieved by, say, children who achieve grade 9 in maths, grade 8 in maths, grade 7 in maths, and so on, by the difference between what PISA says the distribution is and the official distribution. Long story short, I find that England's would drop around 11 points and 14 points would be dropped in Wales if a truly representative sample of the population were drawn. And this would change England's position from, for instance, just above Sweden and above the OECD average to below it, whereas Wales would be just below, or pretty much in line actually with the OECD average, dropping to well below it if a truly representative sample was drawn. In other words, this doesn't seem to be kind of something that's completely trivial. So for the last 5 minutes, let me discuss some of the key points. A summary is there's some clear issues with the PISA data for the UK in 2018. We need to understand these limitations. You don't expect data to be perfect. You don't expect the sample to be perfect. But what you do need is thorough investigations of that, and that to be articulated to you. The biggest problem of this entire story, from my view, is that it was so poorly investigated and articulated, and that better practice is needed in the kind of reporting of these issues in the future. What should be done about this? Well, I think at an international level, there's some real questions that need to be asked of the OECD, and they need to kind of change their processes. They have too much reliance on very sharp cut-offs. So that 80% threshold that I spoke about, that Scotland bizarrely fell over, but really came under, and that made the difference between doing a bias analysis or not. Well, we don't really live in this binary world. What they should really be doing is trying to rate each country's quality of their data, say on a 5-point scale, to get a bit more kind of nuance. On top of that, you know, if they're going to insist on countries like England doing a bias analysis, publish it. You know, don't just say this is what it shows in our opinion, all's okay, Gov. You know, show the evidence and let people make up their own mind. If you want to interpret that evidence a certain way, fair enough, but show people the evidence and they can make up their own mind. We don't just have to believe what you kind of say in the report. You know, experts want to know, particularly given how much impact these kind of studies have. Then what should we be doing within the UK? I've written an open letter to the UK Statistics Authority asking them to look into the reporting of PISA. I'm suggesting that they may want to issue some best practice guidance for how things are reported in the future. My own view is that these kind of bias analyses that I've kind of shown you that I've just done for England and Wales, these could be done at a pupil level as a matter of course. We can draw on our great administrative data to kind of really probe this issue, not just for 2018. Let's go back in time and do it so we can better understand trends and then take that forward into the future. And then we can report this transparently so people understand kind of the strengths and limitations of the data. So there's some very clear action points that I think could be taken away from this kind of work, and I very much hope are kind of taken forward. That's the end of my presentation. And I think I'm pretty much bang on 40 minutes. I think I'm 2 minutes below. So Gemma, over to you. Ask me some probing questions.
Thank you very much, John. I am going to kick off with a question that has appeared on Slido. And in a way, this is about, does OECD prescribe a bias analysis if you fall beneath the magic figure of 80%?
Yes, and that happened in Portugal this time round.
Would their bias analysis, I mean, the two examples you showed were at school level. Does their bias analysis get down to pupil level, or are they quite happy with whatever it is you do on a school level? That's good enough for us? No,
when I've seen it done previously, it's been done at a pupil level. If your pupil response rate falls below 80%. So, of course, the data that's available in different countries to facilitate that bias analysis very much differs. The ideal thing that they ask for, or they would look for, is a measure of achievement on a national test. So, for instance, in England, you would say, well, how did this kid do on Key Stage 2 or GCSEs? So that's the type of thing, you know, Scotland got away with not doing when really they should have done, and could well do with their link to the national data.
I mean, what you've been talking about in the actual presentation, you've covered OECD and their part in this, and you seem to be suggesting that the massaging of the figures in Scotland is OECD more or less agreeing, okay, we won't do a bias analysis here. There's also then what happens at the local level. So, you know, presumably England, for instance, could do pupil level analyses, but chooses not to. So where do you see the real fault on the how the bias analysis gets conducted? Does it lie with the OEC, or is it with member countries?
Well, it's interesting, really. Just with the OECD, they have used these rules, these funny calculations, since 2000. So, you know, their argument when I put this to them was, well, you know, we've done it historically like this. Apparently, they are changing it for next time. So they are going to change their rules. I don't think it's off the back of my study they're changing it, but I think they said to me that they are changing it. So where does fault lie? I think I'm going to say fault lies in both places, to be honest. I think the OECD shouldn't be using these sharp cutoffs. They should be saying to countries, you know, do the best that you can with the tools that you have available. I also think there's fault with national governments in terms of hiding behind what the OECD say. So the response that I've got basically from the Scottish government has been, we met the OECD technical standards. Standard government line, you know, and you're like, guys, come on, look at the evidence, look what you've seen about this ineligibility rate. The ineligibility stuff isn't an OECD criteria. So that slide that I showed you, Scotland is a massive outlier. There's no OECD criteria around that. You can't hide behind OECD rules for things like that. So I think there is kind of responsibility there as well.
Okay, here's another question for you. If PISA is flawed, what would you suggest as an alternative? Or should there be PISA?
I do, despite my discussion today, I do think there should still be PISA. I think the least interesting thing about PISA is the international rankings of average test scores. I don't think it tells us much in general. The changes over time in scores, actually in countries like England, are now less interesting because we've had things like the national reference test that help us give an independent benchmark of performance. I do think they hold some probably interest in other parts of the UK on that matter. So I do think it should still be conducted. What I think can be taken more from things like PISA are they have really good questionnaires. And by linking to our national administrative data, you can investigate really interesting questions about what the correlates are of children's achievement. And I think that's where the value of it is. So these kind of big cross-country comparisons, particularly of average scores or whatever, limited value in my view, particularly so systematically. But the actual data, fine, it has limitations. All data has limitations. That's fine. I do think there's interesting things that can be done with it.
That's interesting. So your answer, what you're bringing out is it's the contextual information that PISA collects on the school system, on parents and pupils. I mean, you and I have worked on the question about what kind of reading material pupils prefer. So it's the contextual questionnaire that to you is adding depth to the PISA's interest.
Yeah, that's definitely one thing. The other thing I would say is, despite all the things I've spoken about here, PISA's still probably the only game in town where we can conduct any kind of comparison of educational achievement or systems across the 4 countries of the UK. So it's not perfect. It's still the best that we have. What I think I'm arguing here is, well, to have more confidence in those types of comparisons, which I think are interesting, let's really drill in the 4 countries to the bias within each of those countries as much as possible, so we can interpret those results and understand those results as robustly as possible. And we can do that as UK, as a country. So I do think there's still value in PISA in various different ways. I think we can get more value by having more confidence in terms of things like, let's look into the bias some more.
So that transparency is a virtue from your point of view, and you've certainly drawn attention to that in your presentation. Okay, another question here. Do you think politicians are aware of the downfalls of the PISA data?
I've tried my best, Gemma. I think they probably are. I think it probably doesn't help with the churn of politicians to some extent, right? You've had what, 17 different Secretary of States for Education in 5 years or whatever. Each one probably comes in, doesn't know much about PISA to begin with, and I think they probably learn pretty quickly about its limitations. Nick Gibb, who's been around forever now, probably knows a lot about the limitations of a lot of PISA. So the churn probably doesn't help. Do I think that civil servants, policymakers within different government departments understand it? Yeah, I probably do think they know a fair amount about it. And they, the further you get away from conducting PISA in different parts of the Department of Education, people will probably know more or less. But I do think there's probably some reasonably strong knowledge there. Politicians, it's going to be more varied.
Have you received an answer to your letter to the ONS? Oh, the Statistics Authority. I mean, are they...
This is interesting, Gemma, because obviously one of the reasons I put out my paper and put out my letter when I did was because there's elections coming up. So it seems like a great time because people are thinking about comparisons of UK across countries. What I didn't factor into my thinking was, it's PIRDA. No one could say anything at the moment, right? So that's the kind of situation at the moment. It's like, well, PIRDA's going on, no one can say anything. So I don't know if that's I don't know if that's an answer or not. I can't say they've said no or yes or whatever. It's just PIRDA. So I'm expecting or hoping that something over the next few weeks might come up. But it's PIRDA.
No, that I must admit I'd forgotten about PIRDA and its relevance to that kind of question.
You're not the only one.
Certainly, I do remember there was a past case back in the New Labour era when I think a politician was told off by the ONS for using the PISA data to support a case it couldn't really support. So there is definitely an interest in the statistical community of drawing attention to the uncertainty in any particular statistical data set and encouraging politicians not to overclaim.
Yeah, like I said, I feel that there's particularly big issues this time around in Scotland on that kind of front. You look at the kind of reporting of it, the change of the test date, the change of the test date. One good example is in 2012 and 2015, if you go to the national report, it very clearly says 90% or something like that, or most of our sample were in S4. You go to the 2018 report, that sentence has been removed, but the rest of the text is very similar to how it was presented previously. It just more could have been done.
You'd have thought the politicians, particularly in Scotland, given the downward trend you were showing in your graph early on, that they might have been quite keen on making a case that this is not reliable data because that it might have offered them some cover.
Yes and no. So Scotland's pulled out of the other international assessments like TIMSS. So PISA's kind of one of the main games in town for them. The Scottish politicians, as far as I've seen so far, have made quite a big deal about their narrow achievement gap in Scotland in PISA, which is unsurprising if you lop off all the low achievers. It's kind of my arguments made today that, wait, we've got great inequality because you kick them all out.
Yeah.
So there's difficult issues there. Also 2018, there was that downward trajectory in 2018. It didn't go up. It seemed to level off.
Yeah.
And it's difficult to know how this really has affected those trends over time because a lot's changed.
That raises another issue. I've got a question here saying, can we ever really compare the UK with other countries, especially with socio-economic differences? I'm going to tag on to that question, John. The point about, we do know that countries vary in their own testing cultures and the extent to which their test cultures incorporate and reflect what PISA asks for. That may mean that in countries where there is less use of data, pupil data, than there is, say, in England, they may be more reliant on the story that PISA tells about the performance of their system. But it may also be that some countries are more determined to get up at the top of the PISA league table and will alter their curriculum accordingly. So given all of this, can we ever really compare the UK with other countries using something like PISA?
Can you really compare? You know, again, I feel you can, but you've got to put the caveats around it. So you've put out two very good caveats there. You know, countries now, PISA has become a country level target, and countries are changing some aspects of the curriculum. You just have to kind of think about that and take that into account when interpreting what you see in the results and the trends over time. It's why I actually think having both PISA and TIMS is sometimes quite useful, and having multiple ones, because you target one but you don't target the other. So you, if you do see some weird trends going on, at least you could identify kind of things like that. In terms of the socioeconomic question, again, you need to be careful around that. So I've done work previously, a blog on Data Lab website about the case of Vietnam, where actually only about half of kids make it into the PISA sample because it's a test of 15-year-olds. Vietnam looks incredibly good in terms of inequality in PISA, but that's because they've got a lot of kids out of school, and PISA is a test for kids in school. So again, you have to be really kind of careful about the interpretation. Yeah.
Do you think the OECD itself is careful enough about interpretation?
Depends who we're calling the OECD. I think actually the OECD analysts are very good and actually are aware very much about lots and lots of these issues and understand them. When you see certain members from the OECD present nice scatter plots claiming X leads to Y, you need to be a bit more cautious.
That's a useful answer. Right, I've got one final question for you. Would PISA's methodology be improved by a longitudinal design?
Yes. Very simple one-word answer. I think you could get more out of it from a longitudinal design, and several countries do have longitudinal follow-up data from PISA, links to national assessment, but also in Australia they've kind of resurveyed the kids year on year and turned it into kind of a longitudinal cohort study. So I do think there's value in doing that, and I think it plays into kind of what I said earlier about kind of the value being the context, the questionnaire, how that links to achievement. So yeah, I do think it would be improved.
Yeah, that's interesting. So that in a way, it would be better if PISA was used as an exploratory tool for exploring causal vectors or causal factors that may genuinely impact on attainment, rather than trying to rank order individual countries and see who's won the PISA race this year.
Yeah, and I always think England's quite a nice example, right, where you've got PISA conducted in November, December of year 11, and then you've got their GCSE outcomes 6 months later. So you can see how those things that they ask about in that kind of background questionnaire link to their GCSE outcomes. So I've done work on this previously. I've got some work looking at kind of anxiety and well-being in year 11 and how that links to kind of kids' GCSE outcomes. I think there's lots of interesting things that could be done kind of around that side, that kind of work.
Okay, right. Well, look, I'm going to wind this session up. I'm going to thank everybody for joining with us. John, that's been a fascinating talk, and it's great to get your reflections on the points in the paper. And in particular, I think you've argued very strongly for the value of having a international data set that allows us to ask complicated questions about education systems. Maybe the current way we're doing this isn't quite right.
Yeah, don't throw the baby out with the bathwater would be my caveat to kind of the presentation, I suppose.
That's a good note upon which to end. Right, can I remind everybody who is listening to this that they can see what the next upcoming lectures in the UCL Minds lecture series will be on the UCL webpage. Stay well. Great event. Thank you very much, John.
Thank you all.
Bye now.
Bye. Cheers, Gemma.